you're back in England and you're about to come to
Yeah,
America?
yeah, I'm going to live with Elijah.
I'm going to probably try to put this out in the next day or so. Do you want to invite anybody to anything, or do you want to go? You want to hide?
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, I don't wanna. I mean, it's not my house, so I feel a little bad. But
Yeah,
like, if
everybody.
anyone wants to come,
Yeah, give us Elijah's address. We'll
yeah, yeah,
show
everyone
up
come
at
to
his
Elijah's
house.
house. I mean,
I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. Cameron is back. He's been traveling on the continent, and we've been trying to set up a time to talk, to catch up a little bit. And I want to talk to him a little bit about a particular passage in Paradise Lost in the second book, as well as a recent video by ContraPoints. I may have another word about the latter in the outro, but it was fun talking to him as always. We were a little pressed for time because he was flying to Chicago. So he is in Chicago for the next week visiting Elijah, and I think Ethan's going to be there. It is, as you may have heard, it's not an official invitation, but he said that I should let you all know that he'll be there, and if any of you is in the Chicago area, write to sleerickets@gmail.com, and I'll pass the word along. I know he would love to have you buy him a drink or show him around your neighborhood. I wish I could be there. I've still never been to Chicago. I've heard it's a great theater town, among other things. Maybe at some point we'll do a thing out there. I think it's a fun conversation. Here's my suspicion about this one. I think this is one that will be of particular interest and particular irritation to the Catholics. Like, what we are really talking about here is not Satanism, exactly, not devils, exactly, not hell, but how these things are imagined by others. I mean, I guess like Brian would probably interject here to say like, oh, what, as opposed to the real hell, the real devil? Yeah, sort of, yes, as opposed to the real version of all those things. Yeah, we're talking about how evil is imagined by those who do not themselves wish to be evil, I suppose. Milton, ContraPoints, J.K. Weisman, among other sources. Cameron also has to get his 2 bits in about Toni Morrison, among a few other things. I hope you will enjoy it. When I was reading through your earlier post about just kind of travel notes, one very small correction I can offer to the section on Italy is simply that what you're hearing is extremely accurate, but they're not motorcycles, they're Vespas.
oh,
Which really has a very different visual effect. So they're like, it definitely is like Italian men are are very showy with their masculinity, but they're also there's a site. I mean, honestly, what it reads as from like dumb American eyes is it reads as gay,
what's that song from that musical where he says, "Is he gay or European?"
with the difference being that they hit on women like it is their job and they're paid on commission. Like it's like it's so much, it's kind of amazing.
Yeah, it's like a machine. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a sort of hydraulic impressiveness to it. Yeah,
hmm
no,
Yeah, I remember dancing with a woman in a club in Florence, and like Italian men would come up and dance behind me to be like like in case I stepped out of the way for a second to like lock into place. It was like a Pez dispenser. Like they were lined up behind me in proximity to her.
sort of ant hive thing.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. They were like very horny, very aggressive, and like the American women we were traveling with were friendly in a way that like the Italian women knew to be icy and aloof, and like that was the kind of the, but like the American women were like, okay, cool, you're hot, yeah, let's hang out. It's like it was sort of bewildering to them, but then the one thing that always really amused me is that there was a guy who would invite the girls in our program back to his pool, and being like drunk art students in their early 20s, they would just get naked and jump in the pool, and it would make him furious. It would make him so mad because in Italy, like they are very obsessively aware of pubic hair. And so
Oh.
if you get into a pool naked, they're like, "Oh my God, what are you doing? You're going to contaminate all the water." So it was a real hard about face from the horniness to sudden like the hygienic maintenance of their pool.
No, Italians are weird because I have a friend from South Naples, from Naples, from the south, and he's in music because he came to Oxford and he didn't he was sort of scared of English culture because he didn't think there was anyone he could tell his sort of vaguely racist jokes to. So I
Oh,
sort of
great, nice.
he'd be sort of have these sort of kind of hyper masculine, quite tough shit, and then he would like be this sort of pussy and he would be able to eat and like any kind of food. And he'd be like, I can't drink coffee with lunch or it'll make me shit for hours or something. Like, what is this odd juxtaposition?
This is
Is
yeah.
taking.
I mean, it
Yeah.
is a little bit like Nietzsche's Übermensch because he was himself so physically frail. Like he was always getting sick for, and like
Yeah,
having
yeah,
these
yeah,
digestive complaints.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, no, maybe the Italians are just sort of the Nietzschean race.
We were going to talk a little bit about like this particular section in the second book of Paradise Lost that I'm kind of fascinated with in concert with ContraPoint's recent video on conspiracy, which like she calls them video essays, which is pretty accurate. Rewatching the most recent one, I thought what it is closer to if I were to try to describe it to like again, my dad is kind of often my standard for like a normal,
Right.
smart, educated person who's just not familiar with any of this. I think
Yeah.
what might be more accurate is to call it something like an intellectual documentary because it's really like it is pretty deeply researched, but it is charting the course of an idea across time.
Yeah.
And what also contrasts her work with the work of like somebody literally reading an essay is that they are lines she's delivering. Like it doesn't have the slightly flat quality of prose read aloud.
Yeah.
It
No,
is,
it's kind of performative. Yeah.
yeah, it's very performed. It's very engaging, and I thought it was really insightful. I had some, some quibbles, but it also seemed very pertinent to this passage in Paradise Lost in the second book where Satan calls on his council of high devils to offer him advice, and he gets. I was rereading it last night. I believe he gets four pieces of advice, really,
Yes.
from Moloch, from Belial, no, from Moloch, from Belial, from Mammon, and then from Beelzebub. And two of them are kind of the same. Although apparently part of what he was doing was like satirizing politicians, and so in a way, like apparently Belial is a satirical representation of a contemporary politician. I kind of think Mammon is in some ways even more accurate because his whole argument is just a straw man of Belial's argument.
Yeah.
He's like, as the last person told you this thing he didn't tell you. But to me, like part of what kind of fascinates me about this passage is that it reveals less, I think, about like the machinations of evil than it does about the imaginings of how evil works from the perspective of good Christians. Like when I
Okay.
was a kid trick or treating, I remember there were always like the healthy houses where they would give you raisins or toothpaste instead of candy. And then there was one house down the hill that would give us these little tracts, these little paper comic books instead of candy. And I always kind of loved them because they were like very weird and like full of like creepy sexuality and violence and strange. And it was only like on a little bit of reflection that I realized they were Baptist tracts. They were like evangelical Christian tracts, but they were what they were about was the Satanists inventing Halloween to seduce children. And so they were like these depictions of like really buxom witches being really depraved in concocting this plan to lure children into hell. And so like from my perspective, it was like a wild gothic entertainment that that was like a crazy imagining of what somebody else must be doing. And
Right,
it
right,
and I
right.
think like there is some of that in Paradise Lost. Like so Moloch's response is just rage. His response is just like, we were just driven out of heaven. Now let's go drive back into heaven and burn it down and take it over. Next to him, Moloch's sceptered king stood up, the strongest and the fiercest spirit that fought in heaven, now fiercer by despair. His trust was with the eternal to be deemed equal in strength, and rather than be less, cared not to be at all. So basically, like, we will take it back or let us all, die trying. Because we're already in hell, so what do we have to lose? Belial gets up and, by my lights, offers like the most sane advice. On the other side, rose up. He hates Belial. I have a theory about what he hates about him because, like, conventionally, a lot of the names for the devil in the Christian tradition are adapted from names of pagan gods. The idea being that, like, well, if you were on Earth and you were worshiping a pagan god, because there is only one god, what you were actually doing is worshiping a devil. And so it was like one or another manifestations of the devil. And so they would take like either the aspects of the devil, the goat horns or this or that, or various names for devils. They would just borrow them from these pagan gods. And they would say, well, these are real and they are real powers. And so you might even have some kind of commerce with them, but they're evil. And so they have all these different manifestations. And then he cites Belial and he says, it's in the first book. Where is it? Because it's a great little passage. Belial came last. This is in book 1. Than whom a spirit more lewd fell not from heaven, or more gross to love vice for itself. To him no temple stood or altar smoked. Yet who more oft than he in temples and at altars when the priest turns atheist, as did Eli's sons, who filled with lust and violence the house of God. And there's a story in 1 Samuel about this priest's sons using the priesthood for corrupt purposes. But basically, like, I kind of love the idea that, like, there are all these different devils who are manifested in the like on Earth in the presentation of pagan gods, but Belial is the devil of atheism, basically, because even he refers, to how seemingly reasonable he is. And again, his advice is like, basically, he says, like, what's wrong with Belial's advice is he didn't mean it. He just was lazy. But his argument, I think, is quite touching. He says, for who would lose through, he says, like, first of all, like, we do have something to lose. For who would lose, though full of pain, this intellectual being, those thoughts that wander through eternity to perish rather, swallowed up and lost in the wide womb of uncreated night, devoid of sense and motion. He says, like, is this then worst? Like, are we sure this is the worst we can have? We're sure it can't get worse than this? Or from above should intermitted vengeance arm again his red right hand to plague us. Like, God could make things worse for us. And then he says, basically, like, first, like, let's calm down, stay down here for a while, and void of pain, this horror will grow mild, this darkness light. And, like, let's make the most of what we have, rather than trying to go back to war again. We're down here, maybe eventually we can make peace with God. Let's not go, like, starting new fires. Mammon then gets up and says, yes, well, Belial wants us to go to war later, so let's not do that. But he basically says, do the same as Belial. And then Beelzebub gives the final advice, which is the advice that gets followed. Just quickly, I noticed last night, I think Thomas Gray, who has this famous passage in Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard that provided the title to a beloved Richard Wilbur poem called This Pleasing Anxious Being. The lines are, for who to dumb forgetfulness a prey, this pleasing anxious being ere resigned. I thought that line surely was echoing, for who would lose though full of pain, this intellectual being.
I mean, yeah, almost certainly. Especially because he then mentions, was it
And you
the
mentions Milton, yeah,
Mute Inglorious Milton.
Inglorious Milton's, yeah. So clearly he had Milton in his mind. But I just thought, like, I'm always kind of like, there was a Elijah interview.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, JMW the other day, and I thought a pretty James Matthew Wilson, pretty good interview. And he read a poem I liked better than most of his, but the first line kept sticking in my head, and I was finally like, oh, that's a borrowing from Leda and the Swan. But I'm always kind of like excited to find those little vague echoes, because I do that when I'm writing, and I don't realize I'm doing it, but it's just that's like part of the landscape that is formed in your mind from reading a lot of
Yeah, me too.
So we can get to Belial.
What was his quote?
I can get to Beelzebub's advice, but I thought I'd let you jump in.
Yeah. No, it's interesting that you read it politically, or because.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that was just the footnotes in the thing said politics.
Yeah, okay. I know I never read footnotes. It's terrible. When I was reading, I was rereading it like half an hour ago, and I realized that what it strikes me as is sort of the psychological representation of the reaction to suffering. So the four
Hmm.
different
Right.
speeches,
Almost like stages of grief.
yeah, or even sort of allegorical representations of various, reactions to an instance of suffering. And for that reason, I too really like Baliol's the incarnation of atheistic skepticism. I do really quite like his speech because yeah, there's something kind of beautiful and soothing in it as a sort of response to suffering. I mean, I see when you sort of talk about how you dislike the poem overall as especially as sort of a character study of Satan and where you don't seem to quite get why people love Satan. I do understand it because Milton isn't a character writer
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
like any intense sense. But I guess the pleasure I get out of the character of Satan is the sort of allegorical pleasure I get out of his kind of embodiment as sort of the endlessly, heroically, and tragically striving will in sort of this sort of intense moment of suffering. So yeah, I get that. I guess that's how I read it. I totally agree. I was actually having very similar thoughts to you when you said about with the Halloween analogy, sort of roundabout way, because I was reading it again and I was thinking about sort of Milton's sort of monomaniacal Christianity, and I've been thinking quite a lot about sort of religion and monomania, because there's a lot of sort of very monomaniacally created people who suddenly sort of subsume their egotism within a sort of greater religion. I mean,
Yeah.
like Milton is one, Kanye West is another. These people who sort of extremely egotistical about their own, creative powers, but at the
Yeah.
same time simultaneously like need this infinitely superior power to sort of what's the word? Sort of throw themselves on their belly before, right? Sort of, level themselves before. And
Yeah.
when Milton is of the devil's party without knowing it, as Blake says, and he does these sort of incarnations of these devils that he probably does despise in the intensity of his religiosity.
Yeah.
What strikes me is that like he's fulfilling if sort of I don't know to jump from one person to another. Nietzsche says Nietzsche loves to call Christianity this kind of death obsessed life negating cult, and it's
Right.
fascinating that even in sort of the moments when Milton focuses on the elements that are sort of religious enemies to himself, the intensity of the poetry and the intensity of the psychological power sort of lives even in even in the negation to itself, just as how in your example it was the intensity and power and spectacle of the Halloween images you were given that was
Right.
that
Right.
was fascinating,
They
right?
were
Not
really
like
throwing themselves into imagining
yeah
this. Yeah.
yeah. There's something sort of life fulfilling almost, or artistically fulfilling and fulfilled in the enactment of this thing that they, probably consciously hate and despise. And I guess like that's what I get. I get this sort of same feeling with Milton, all throughout the entire sort of portrayal of all the devils and Satan, but like especially in this chapter where it seems almost despite himself, everything has come to such a sort of intense and sort of beautiful linguistic fullness. But yeah, I get like I yeah, that's how I read. That's how I read that's how the discourse strikes me, at least. It's sort of
Yeah.
the psychological aragonical study of a response to suffering.
Like there are a couple different ways that you can use the voice of the devil in literature, and there Marlowe's sometimes held up as an example of somebody who like took advantage of the opportunity to speak in the devil's voice in order to say some interesting things that would probably be hard to say otherwise, which is one way of doing it.
Yeah.
It does feel like there is a
Bulgakov as well. The
sorry.
Master and Margaret.
Oh yeah,
Bulgakov, the Master and me.
whom I've
Yeah, he
not
did
read,
a
but
similar
yeah,
thing.
that's
Yeah.
a yeah. The devil might say this is a, the villain might say this is often a good
Right.
opportunity to kind of to smuggle in just some sort of provocative thought, or kind of forbidden thought. But yeah, there is this other tendency, and to me, Milton, for the most part, indulges in it pretty profoundly, which is what must it be like to be against us? And like an example I think of is the Huysman novel Là-bas, which is like a bonkers novel that's half like historical research about Gilles de Rais, who truly is like, if the legends are true, like maybe the evilest man who ever lived. Aleister Crowley's not the wickedest man who lived, but what they called him, the wickedest man in London, the wickedest man alive. But like Gilles de Rais tortured and sacrificed like thousands of children in his castle, literally trying to like make deals with the devil. But in the book, there's sort of like half of it's historical research into Gilles de Rais, and then half of it is this imagining of like the main character discovers a sect of Satanists living in modern day Paris, modern day being late 19th century. And the way he describes them, they just like do whatever's most horrible. Like they make like their black mass, which he witnesses, is like whatever's the most disgusting version. They like do things with their bodies that are just sort of like repulsive to everybody. They will like defecate on, the sacraments. They will, stamp on the Eucharist. They'll do like they burn and invert and desecrate and blacken and putrefy anything sacred. And the question I keep asking throughout is like, but why? Like, what do they like? What? I get why it's horrible to you, the Catholic, but like, why would they want to do any of this? And it is like in recent years there's been this sort of odd revival of like satanic imagining in a way that I'm kind of fascinated by, because it's like even in like somewhat like naive pop culture. Like I think of the Ready or Not, or The Babysitter, or The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which is like a reboot of a kid's show. And they're all like these like florid imaginings of Satanists, or Evil, the TV show. And they're, again, it's like, what do the bad guys want? They want to be evil. And it just feels like, well, it's this sort of the imagining of this sort of highly organized, highly deliberate, but like fundamentally perverted and like malevolent force that it feels like, well, what is the what are they in it for? Like they're like, yes, the devil is real and hell is real and we will burn in hell for eternity for what we're doing. Ha ha ha, let's be evil. And you're like, well, what what's your goal? And it does feel like there's like a fundamental limitation to the imagination when that is your vision of the enemy. And it does feel like there's a certain pattern of thought that really gleefully like adopts that perspective.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there's sort of a moral absolutism that kind of chains this sort of desire. There's sort of like two things happening, right? There's an imaginative leap outward towards the opposite. And at the same time, there's this kind of moral absolutism, or this inflexible moral comprehension that sort of chains that sort of leaping part of the imagination down and stops it from sort of fully dispersing itself into something completely different. And it's sort of this interesting connection. I mean,
and there's a self-centeredness too, because it's like, what do they want? They want whatever I hate most.
yeah, well, it reminds me a bit. I was reading about this sort of sect of Gnostics, and not a lot of Gnostics try and interpret, the juxtapositions or the confusions in God's behavior as a distance between the demiurge being the Old Testament God and sort of the New Testament God being the true, greater, pure, divine being. But I was reading about the sect of Gnostics who decided that since the Old Testament God is sort of the demiurge, the ruler of an evil universe, and they had to escape it, then they simply what they needed to do was to reverse all the moral laws set out by the sort of the Hebrewic God, the Ten Commandments and all the other sort of moral commandments. So they would sort of commit these acts that would seem utterly probably still abhorrent to our Judeo-Christianly inflected moral consciousness. But at least for them, there was sort of there was an understanding that actually what we're doing is allowing us to escape this terrible world to enter something beautiful and pure. You know what I mean? They're not.
But that's the justification for like the Inquisition. Like that's the justification for like most like religious like massacres and atrocities. It's not that they want to be evil. It's that they say like, well, we must do this very unpleasant thing in the service of this greater good, even if, in many cases, the people actually carrying out those plans are themselves genuine sadists and psychopaths.
Yeah.
Ostensibly, there is a greater, like, that's the thing, is I think there is such a thing as a sort of like a curdled, spiteful, like, malevolence and malice. I just think that it tends to exist more often at a more individual level. Like there are pure sadists. There's like Ted Bundy, right, who just genuinely took pleasure in like the nightmarish suffering of others. There are psychopaths like that, and they're psychopaths very like there are also people who get so poisoned by revenge and pain that they kind of descend into the state of wishing evil on their enemies in a really in a demonic way, in a
Yeah,
Beelzebubian
yeah.
way. But again, that tends to be more personal and individual. There, like it just seldom is there like a large, organized, static, or even like continuous conscious enterprise that like whose larger goal is the perpetuation of evil qua evil. It's just like that, and it
Right,
does feel
right.
like that's something that is very much in the imagination of, like, I mean, people of all political perspectives. Like there is just such a remarkable tendency to imagine your enemy as being fundamentally demonic. And that's the advice that finally Satan takes is Beelzebub's advice, which is it's not let's take heaven back. It's not let's make the best of hell. It's, hey, I've heard there's this new place and it's called Earth. And there are people who live there who are like us, but they're weaker. So he says, here perhaps some advantageous act may be achieved by sudden onset, either with hell fire to waste his whole creation, or possess all as our own, and to drive as we were driven the puny habitants, or if not drive, seduce them to our party, that their God may prove their foe, and with repenting hand abolish his own works. This would surpass common revenge, and interrupt his joy in our confusion, and our joy upraise in his disturbance, when his darling sons, hurled headlong to partake with us, shall curse their frail originals and faded bliss. So, like, he briefly mentions the idea that, like, oh, the devils might take over Earth, but really, like, the beginning and the end of his argument is think about all of the suffering we'll cause. How, if we will, he's right now sadistically relishing our suffering. What if we could turn the tables and make him suffer, and then we would be really thrilled with all of the evil that we'd caused him and his creation. That, like, it's a plan out of spite that is that sort of that becomes the raison d'etre not only of like Satan's mission to Earth, but like all of hell.
Yeah, well, it's that I agree, and it's interesting because, as you say, Satan takes the path of the psychopath. He takes the path of the pure, emptied out revenger instead of the path of sort of the dogmatic assault or colonization, right? That you have the first two speakers variously pose, or at least the first speaker does, and the second one may. But it's interesting
Well,
because I'll give.
the first three are at least pursuing something like a self-interest.
Yeah, well the third one's pursuing peace, right? Or
I mean,
continuous.
the third one pretends to distinguish himself from the second, but really second, and third are basically saying the same thing.
Yeah. But they're pursuing a program based on not a philosophy, say, but a kind of sort of ideological contingent, right? A kind of a concept of how they should live, right? Which is either complete total response or the realization that their current state is not as terrible as it could be. While the third one is pursuing, as you say, just individualistic drive for destruction, revenge. And I'll give, or the fourth one, I should say, Beelzebub. But I'll give Milton some credit with this one because I do think you can kind of chart Satan's sort of mental collapse somewhat, or at least sort of colonization by this kind of particular kind of, I don't know, emptied out destructiveness as he continues down this path. He says something like, I myself am, the famous line, right? I myself am hell. Whether I fly, there will always be hell within every deep, a greater deep. That he becomes so colonized by this purely sort of individualistic sort of yearning for destruction and for sort of pure, revenge and suffering and sort of the emptiness, the nothingness that comes after those things. He sort of becomes colonized by the void in that way, which I think is much more, I think relies much more heavily on having to follow the path of this sort of individualistic task or revenge instead of like, yeah, it'd be fascinating. What would Satan be like, or what would the book be like if they just chose to attack heaven again? And then,
Oh yeah, yeah,
obviously got
no,
defeated.
yeah.
But
Like
that
he
would be a
needs.
very different
Yeah, yeah,
psychological
yeah.
task.
It surely would be. I think the trouble is that this sort of curdling and this like turn toward obsessive spitefulness and malice does happen, but again, it tends to happen in an individual or time dependent way. Like, I mean, I think like this did happen with Hitler. I mean, he, who didn't need much help getting worse, but like by the end of the war, he was actively diverting funds and resources from the defense of Berlin, which was getting bombed like the Allies were dropping about 50,000 bombs a day on Berlin.
Mm.
And he diverted all of the resources from like anti-aircraft and like defense of Berlin toward the development of more bombs to drop on London. Like he just
Yeah,
wanted to inflict more pain. And he even like would
yeah,
refer to them as like revenge weapons. So like that happens, but the problem is like at the same time that was happening, all of like if you want like a genuinely demonic like sustained organization, it's hard to get better than the SS. Like they're about the most evil organized and enterprise that's existed, but it was also like entirely cellular and divided at that point. Like you had individual commandants and ober this and that making their own plans to negotiate with allies and like saving up resources this direction or another. Like it was all falling apart, and it was all falling apart in individualistic, self-serving ways because again, like I think Lewis's oh sorry that's my alarm. I think like Lewis's argument against Manichaeanism is pretty strong. Like the problem with a larger force of evil fighting a larger force of good is that like all of the things that make the larger force of evil threatening are good qualities like like dedication and strength and intelligence, right? And focus. That like when you take like the more evil one side gets, the weaker and more chaotic and more collapsible it gets. So the idea that like there is in the universe this sustained evil enterprise, this the force of evil weighing on us, it just feels like it's like implausible, and it seems like doesn't make for very insightful personal morality either. And this is like I was citing like some pop culture, and I'm citing a 400-year-old book, but or how old is this book? 350 years? I don't know. But like
400, I'd say.
this is also increasingly the Christian right wing today. I mean, I read an article, and Ethan was like apologizing for this. And he's not apologizing for it, but like he was saying he also had his misgivings about this like very popular Christian blogger named Rod Dreher, who's like genuinely believes that they're like literal demons doing commerce with progressive culture at large, and that this isn't like an organized sustained cosmic force of evil with its evil agenda. And like it just seems like a like it's extremely hard to believe in that, and b it can't make for very good personal moral hygiene to think that that's what you're up against, rather than like the varied incentives of lots of different people who are all trying to pursue their own good,
Right. Yeah.
as well
Yeah.
as you with your own incentives.
Yeah.
Because again, like
No. Yeah.
when your enemy is evil en masse, then it becomes very easy to justify your own extreme response to that.
It always strikes me as more convincing. I mean, like, I'm not. How do I say this? It's not that I think that anyone is really possessed by demons, but I think like to use a metaphor, and obviously this in this blogger's case, it's not a metaphor, but to sort of think of like I don't know some kind of demonic presence within an individual person as a kind of nothingness or void, I think makes vague sense.
Yeah,
But
oh,
to think of
totally,
it as
totally, yeah.
yeah, but to think of it as an influence upon a sort of group is meaningless because evil in that sense is just sort of the water squeezed from the sponge of dogma, but the dogma itself isn't particularly this kind of pure evil as you say. It's just morality taken and polluted to to a sadistic extreme, and that then recruits into itself, the individuals, the psychopaths, the sort of people with the nothingness inside them, which are maybe more purely instances of this evil that sort of these that sort of the yeah, well, it's not just Christians, but a lot of these kind of Christian commentators like to perceive in the greater forces they battle. But yeah, no, I mean, I agree with this sort of criticism of Manichaeism.
And like leftists don't believe in God and the devil, but the way they talk about right wingers, it
Right.
really may as well be that they are the forces of evil. Like that really
Well,
is
yeah.
increasingly the conception of the other side
Yeah, well,
is
they've
you
just
are,
found
yeah,
a trendier God and the devil to play
right,
into.
yeah, you're intentionally on, like, this is the same argument about like colonialist ways of being. This argument, like, it's true, like, and honestly, like the way you hear both, pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian commentators talk about the essence of the other side, that like
Right, yeah.
Palestinians are an evil death cult, or like Israelis, Zionists are an evil colonialist enterprise, genocidal regime. And again, like there's the question of like what are people doing versus like what is the essence of the enemy.
It's a vaguely an amusing and trendy way to sort of both to sort of be in a group of people who you can actively say, we hate eugenics, but also sort of take a little bit of a eugenic idea, but turn it a bit mystical and apply it to both your side and the other side, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's like many of these reasons why I've completely grown disinterested in both the left and the right as like camps I want to put myself in. Like, yeah, at this point, I sort of feel almost a mutual amount of disgust with both of them.
There was this. So I read a very bad book. I think I mentioned this to you off mic. It was very badly written. It was very annoying. Very bad thinking in it. But it had kind of an interesting idea in its core. This is called "How to Blow Up a Pipeline" by Andreas Malm. I highly recommend the movie that isn't really even based on the book, but just takes the title of the book. It's a like fiction feature film, very well done, like very propulsive, smart, thoughtful, like with real characters. It's not, it has an agenda, but it actually is not, it's not simplistic. So I highly recommend the movie. The book is very bad. Like this is like an example of like, well, you're part of this political movement. I wish somebody who was a better writer had written the book and you would just let that person take over, because he's very bad at writing, but he has this idea in here, which is adapted from adapted from a feminist idea actually, or an idea from feminist critique of the radical flank. And his argument basically is like, we misinterpret the moments in the past when there was a split on the left. We misinterpret like the Obama's moment when he disavowed Reverend Wright, who had said "Goddamn America," and Obama said, "No, no, no, no. We need to bring people together, not split people apart." When Bill Clinton condemned the rhetoric of Sister Soldier, when Martin Luther King splits off from the Malcolm X and Martin Luther King kind of like are two divergent paths, and we say, oh no, we prefer the peaceful one. He says like this happens again and again across the history of social justice, and we misinterpret it, because what we think is happening is we think what's happened is that the peaceful path, the more conciliatory path, the more moderate path is the one that has carried the day. And the sort of the lesson we take from that is, oh, peace and conciliation is the more effective way to get what you want. He says that's actually wrong. That this is a mutually beneficial agenda, and that Martin Luther King does need to split off from and disavow violence and separate himself from Malcolm X, but he actually also needs Malcolm X to be there to provide the contrast. It's not just that Obama needs to disavow Reverend Wright, he needs Reverend Wright to be there to be disavowed. And his argument is basically that like the environmentalist movement has been all peace and love and all, hey, we need, like nerdy, annoying lectures, and then like movements that are fundamentally, profoundly peaceful and take great care not to hurt any human being. And like the little bit of like vandalism that has been part of the eco movement in the past, that's been disavowed and that's been poo-pooed. And we don't want to burn anything down. We don't want to blow anything up. We want to protest. We want to chain ourselves to bulldozers, but we just want to we want peace, and we want annoying speeches and no violent disruption. And he said, what we really need is a violent, scary wing. Like if there is a violent, scary eco-terrorist wing, then we will have a contrast. And then suddenly the Greta Thunbergs will become appealing because they will be peaceful and conciliatory in contrast to the scary, dark, violent wing. And so like what I thought was remarkable is that he's talking specifically about eco-terrorism, but it also took me back to like I think like some of the great errors that happened in like American politics in 2020, that like the liberals and the left discovered this radical rhetoric and radical wing, and the argument was that like the emergence of a radical extreme stance, we need to abolish prisons, we need to defund the police, we need to we had big violent riots, we need to use like violent, like ironically or maybe not so ironically misandrist rhetoric. We need to overtly, confrontationally, violently attack the status quo on behalf of oppressed peoples. And the read from that was either like, oh, well, the progressives lost their nerve and didn't go far enough, or the read is, oh, they got too extreme and weird, or like trans rights activists got too extreme and weird, and so it turned everybody off. And in a way, it feels like there's a slightly subtler and more cynical read, which is, no, you wanted that extreme rhetoric and that scary, sometimes violent flank to emerge, and then, in order to achieve your goals, you needed to disavow it. And that's what like the liberals had the worst of both worlds. Like they like were too cowardly to follow through with the extreme agenda, but they were also too cowardly to disavow it. And so they just got nothing. But it felt like there's this other strange thing happening on the right where there's a kind of a shrugging, passive, smirking disavowal, like, oh, we're not really racist. Oh, we're not really. Then also takes advantage of all of the forcefulness of the radical flank. But yeah, I just thought like it was a very bad book with kind of one interesting idea in it.
You've told me about the idea before, but out of interest, why is the book so? Is it badly written? Or
It's bad. I mean, in fairness to him, and I'm very curious about. There was another book you asked me to read that I have some initial quibbles with, but Andreas Malm is like
written book with a very bad idea.
Well, yeah. So English is not his first language. I mean, he's let me put it this way: he speaks extremely good English, but like if you're going to write a book in a language, then like your English needs to be really top notch, and it's not that. And then he the title of the book is How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and you keep thinking he's leading up to this moment of like, okay, here's how we organize some like actual, if not terrorism, like major serious property destruction. And then the climax of the book is, and then we tore down some fences and the news in Sweden was scandalized. You're like, what? I mean, so like so much of it, or like in the beginning is all like, hey, I was at this protest once and we stopped traffic, and boy, the drivers were so annoyed. It really felt radical. And you're like, I don't know, man, that doesn't seem like it's very effective. Yeah. So he just seems like kind of a dum-dum who is very, very, very self-serious and very proud of his own dumb activism, and he sort of stumbles past some interesting ideas, but it's just like it's very boringly written. It's not, I mean, it's like, for being as short as it was, it took for fucking ever to get through. So yeah. The movie is everything this is not, including actually radical. Like the movie is much more aptly titled How to Blow Up a Pipeline. And I mean, it does like it again, like I think it's smart enough that it's not mere propaganda, but I recommend it.
Yeah. Maybe we should talk. We talked about a bit about Milton. Have you got anything more to say about the ContraPoints? It was interesting because I didn't like this one as much as the other ones. I must admit, I didn't like it as much as the Twilight video.
Oh, the Twilight one, I just was like, I couldn't get into because it was so alien to me. I just didn't know any of it.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched a couple of the films. I haven't read any of the books, but I don't know. I think this one, I felt dissatisfied by the end. I watched it and I thought, yes, you've outlined quite well a lot of the psychological reasons behind conspiracy theories, and you've managed to disprove that most conspiracy theories are likely to be real. Well done. But like I felt That was sort of a lack of a
And sorry,
sort of,
just to
I don't
clarify,
know.
because the way you said it, most conspiracy theories are not likely to be real.
Yeah, so
Yes.
she, as in, she managed to disprove
Yeah, yeah,
most
I mean,
current
less disprove than
conspiracy
like
theories.
demonstrate the tendency of
Yes,
thinking that leads to this. Yeah,
yes, yeah, or the arrant absurdity
because she makes the
that,
point of saying
yeah,
like actually to debunk all of these claims would take forever, and they would just be more
right,
claims
right,
by the time I was done.
right, right. But there felt like there was something missing, as if there was some greater impetus behind these things that she hadn't quite got to.
I do
I
think
can't,
the ending she bungles a little bit when the ending is about
yeah,
the motivation.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so she
yeah.
lists.
Remind me, because I
Yeah, yeah,
haven't
yeah.
watched it in like a month, so remind
Right.
me a bit about it.
So the like the parts I found most compelling were when she talked about her interpretation of the core beliefs of conspiracism, and then when she talked about guilt and humiliation as a motivation. I thought like that was very insightful, and it was even just like some information I didn't have. But then the part that I thought was sort of like, in a way, she kind of got her start making videos about like alt-right themes, and her goal was to address the people who adopted those beliefs and like make a reasonable and entertaining appeal to them to reconsider their perspective. So like part of what she got grief as well as celebration for was not merely dunking on right wingers she disagreed with, but like trying to take them seriously and address what they were thinking and maybe pull at some threads within it. And I think that's where she sort of faltered here. And you can tell like it's a very long video, and by the time she gets to the end of it, she is pretty like annoyed. Like she does at one point, she's like, you're so dumb, I can't take it. And she lists at the end what she identifies as the four needs that pursuing conspiracism feeds. Like, why do people get into this? They have these needs, and like throwing yourself into conspiracy theory thinking satisfies these needs. And then she identifies the needs, and I think she does a very bad job of identifying the needs, because what she says is what you need that this pattern of thought satisfies is: one, freedom from fear; two, inflated self-esteem; three, revenged humiliation; and four, denial of privilege. And when I was watching those, I thought, like, well, you're getting at something, but what you've basically said is the people are pursuing the people fall into this rabbit hole because they need four stupid, bad things that they shouldn't need. And I reworked these to be something closer to like a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of self-worth, and a sense of absolution. And some of those overlap. But it felt like that's what people are pursuing. And maybe conspiracism, I mean, not maybe, definitely conspiracist thinking satisfies those needs in a fundamentally unhealthy way. But the needs themselves, I don't think are perverted, wrong, bad, like dumb white guy needs. I think they're human needs. And that to me
Oh
felt
yeah.
like her biggest bungle.
Well, I mean, yeah, progressivism, you could say, almost exists on all four of those needs in subset, or some
Yeah, well,
kinds of
like though, yeah,
progressivism.
those are needs everybody has, and they're just different ways of pursuing it.
Yeah.
And so, if you feel disenfranchised, you feel like you're lacking meaning, purpose, self worth, and absolution. Then, like feeling guilty for what feels like no reason, or for what I mean. Although there is the guilt thing was very interesting. Just like things I didn't know about being like the patient zero for the recovered memory movement, which for people who are not
Oh yeah.
familiar, like there was this movement in the 80s and 90s in which there was two things. One was the recovered memory therapy, which was therapists would hypnotize patients and ask them, what turned out to be very leading questions about their past. And lots of people started remembering having been molested, and specifically remembering that their parents or their caretakers or their, kindergarten teachers were all secret Satanists who incorporated the children into horrifying satanic rituals. And so the patient zero who like led to this becoming so the second half of it was, one was recovered memory therapy, the other was the satanic panic, which was suddenly the whole country became obsessively frightened with the idea that there was this massive secret network of Satanists murdering hundreds of thousands of children all the time. And then like people went to prison and like people had their lives destroyed over this imaginary nationwide sect of terrorists. The patient zero for this, the person whose case initiated all of this, went into therapy. This was what I didn't know, because she had a miscarriage. She lost a baby and she felt a terrible guilt over losing that baby. And then her therapist decided that, like, oh, maybe the reason you feel guilt over this is that let's see if something really horrifyingly traumatic happened to you when you were a child. Oh, and guess what? It turns out that what happened to you when you were a child is that your parents were involving you in rituals that incorporated the murder of children. So like you were watching babies get murdered as a child, and that's why you feel guilty over losing your miscarriage. So like it just felt like it was so paint by numbers in terms of the motivation that it was almost laughable. The other one that was, I mean, she I think makes a very good point about the 9/11 truthers and national guilt over the Iraq War. But the other example just didn't know about at all was that the guy who fired off a gun in Comet Ping Pong, which was the idea of Comet, this was that the idea was that in the basement of this pizza place in DC, people were sacrificing children. And so he drove hundreds of miles to this pizza place in DC, carried an assault rifle in, fired it off inside the restaurant. Thankfully, didn't hurt anybody. But he was doing it to save the children. And he left this whole long voicemail to his kids about how it was important to protect children, to save the children. What I didn't know about at all that she points out is that a month before he did this, he hit a kid with his car. The kid didn't die, but was severely injured. And so like it is sort of striking how there does seem to be a kind of a projection of internalized guilt onto the other in some of these cases. So like that I was very intrigued by. I just think that in kind of expanding her explanation to like larger trends and groups of people who get really into conspiracy thinking, conspiracy theory, thinking, she really just sort of, it was curdled in her own mind when she was articulating it, and she could only articulate it with disparagement rather than with understanding.
Yeah, and I wonder sometimes if there's a sort of weakened partisanship. Because, the kind of thinking, as we were talking about earlier, kind of thinking from both the left and the right about the left and the right, about, them being evil, is in some sense, isn't totally conspiracy theory, isn't obviously of that mold completely, but is in some sense a prototype of the kind of heightened conceptualization that conspiracy theory involves, right? I do wonder a little bit lately if she's a little held down by her quite left-wing audience, because I think it stops her sometimes from, approaching something more non-partisanly is a little cliched, but in that kind of manner, more openly, more wildly, more even sort of more out of left field. There always has to be a kind of outrage and concern for her and from our audience. There always has to be a sense of the good somewhere lurking, over your shoulder that helps you out. It's interesting.
She does seem to need to signal that she's still
Yeah.
one of the, I mean, although at the moment the left hate her. I don't know if you're keyed into this.
I
Because
knew.
she posted something on Palestine.
Oh, I don't know about. I knew about the old reasons. Why do they hate her now?
Well, yeah, I
What
mean,
did
there
she
are lots
post
of. She's been in trouble for various reasons, and her video on canceling is really good.
Oh yeah,
And very
yeah.
funny, because she talks about her own cancellation. She posted something on Palestine where she said, "Yes, Israel's committing a genocide. Yes, this is horrifying and infuriating." But then I don't want to dwell on it too much because it's not like I don't want this to then be all about that. But she
Sure.
made a comment that I thought it did feel to me a little bit misplaced. In that she said, oh shoot. Basically, yeah. I mean, it's long. I don't want to read the whole thing, but it seems to be that basically like insisting on some of the language that the hard left has used, and insisting on this is actually like a longish essay, which is probably worth taking a little bit of time with. It's been
Hmm.
very simplified and condemned by the left, but her shift is basically like I think the error she makes is that she feels like she can't be descriptive without also being prescriptive. And so she says basically like
Yeah.
the rhetoric of the left in approaching this crisis has been very bad for the brand and has done a very bad job of bringing people into the tent and has put people off from liberals and the left rather than recruiting them in. And to me, it just felt like, well, these are sort of separate questions. Like it's possible to say, here's a descriptive account of what's happening versus here's a prescriptive account of how we ought to be responding to what's happening. And it did seem like she sometimes feels like, even like in the conspiracy essay, like it is hard for her to separate those two agendas. That it's just like, and maybe I'm too simplistic in my thinking that like you can just, those can be separate things. They don't have to be, you don't have to do both all the time. But yeah, at the moment, the left are all furious at her for this.
Oh well, the left are always furious at her.
Yeah,
I tell you what, you tell you what, I'm sick of the left. I'm sick of the left's endless screed of there's a genocide happening and I am doing this type poem that I see everywhere. I see poems. There's eggs. I'm thinking about this. I can't do this. There's a genocide happening. It irritates me for two reasons. One, because they never seem brave enough to face off the actual moral problem, which is there's a genocide happening and I can do basically nothing about it and must live my utterly, happy, well, not happy, but utterly safe life in the knowledge simultaneously that this genocide is happening, right? Like, they never truly seem to face up to that. I mean, I guess Ilya Kaminsky did it a bit with In the War We Slept in America. But even then, that poem's sort of animated by a sort of weird, resentment about the very fact of it, a kind of sort of carrying, a cry that we shouldn't have, be sleeping in the middle of, the war. We shouldn't be sleeping or living in America happily while there's a war going on, whatever. Like, even that poem, when facing up to that terrible fact, then tries to avoid it by making some kind of moral outcry about it. But these left poems, they never seem to really face up to the fact that, there's a genocide going on and I'm a bourgeois academic and can do nothing about it apart from, making a few meaningless academic statements and reading some Palestinian poetry. So they fail to admit this. And then secondly, it just annoys me because I'm like, there's a genocide going, there was maybe not a genocide going on, but there was like a war going on before Palestine, right? Like, I'm so glad
there's always an atrocity happening. There's always,
so
which
glad
isn't to dismiss them. It's horrifying.
Oh, no,
but it's never not happening.
Yeah, but of course for these progressives, like I'm so glad that you guys have suddenly realized that you're living a contented life while there's horrors going on. But actually horrors are going on long before the Palestinian thing. So your poem's late to the fucking party with that. But yeah, I've just seen so many of these poems of late, and they just all seem to be very contemptible and very boring. Very boring. I also pretty formulaic.
Yeah,
that's
my
cancelable rant.
I have not tuned into. It's been a second since I tuned into the contemporary poetry moment.
Talking of, before we move on,
ahead.
talking of Israel and Palestine, I'd like to respond to what Brian Platzer said about 20 episodes ago. He said why is Cameron talking about Israel and Palestine? And I kind of agree with him because I listened to the episode I was on. We were talking about Israel and Palestine in that book, and I realized I made no interesting comments at all in that episode. So I just want to say to Brian that, next time I talk about a subject of political controversy that may at first seem outside of my literary wheelhouse, I just want to say that I will come out with something I'll come out with such a strange and blazing opinion that questions will not be asked about why I'm the person talking about this thing, but how the hell could I have form such an opinion on the matter in the first place. So yeah, I promise to do that.
You'll live up to your reputation as the. Are you gonna transition from being the woke child to the based child?
Yeah, maybe. Why not? Why not? I mean, to be fair, this watching the conspiracy theory video, the thing you really get appreciation for is both the horribleness, but also the brutal sort of internet effectiveness of websites like 4chan. Horrible places full of, some of the most sort of psychopathic and nihilistic and sort of perverted people on the planet, but also people of extreme digital skill, that sort of, rivals at times sort of the power of a government or a secret service to do things. So you've got to be impressed, like in a sort of maybe Miltonic way, even if you sort of take a sort of a morally outraged stance against them.
So I am curious because I just barely started reading it. We can't get into it today, but you I think with many caveats and without an adoption of the politics involved. You recommended
I
this
hope
book,
not.
Bronze Age Mindset, by a poster who was posting online as Bronze Age pervert. Although I see on the spine, I will say there are a lot of there are a lot of printing problems in the in the press. And what I'm realizing now is that the printer must have read Bronze Age pervert as first, middle, and last name, because on the spine it says bronze pervert. And this is a book, it is very badly printed, and the I noticed like the first sentence is missing an article, the fourth sentence is missing an article, many sentences that succeed. I mean, it made me think his
I
first
mean, that's
language is
just
like a
that's
Slavic
his
language,
stylistics.
but is this like, okay, so partly is he writes in broken English online is part of it. I mean, it's not all broken, but it's a little broken.
So I like this book enough to download his other book that he published under his real name, and then I
Okay.
stopped reading it because it became very much a book about race theory and
He
eugenics, and
does
I
seem
found
to
that
be
much
like he's just
much
an
less
out and out
interesting.
eugenicist, right?
Oh yeah, he's an out and out
How is
fascist.
that like the
But
thing I don't get about this is like racism, it's so boring. It's such a boring extreme, but they're extreme positions that are so much more interesting.
yeah,
Like, yeah,
well
sorry,
that's
go
that's
ahead.
why I like him because he does take much more interesting extreme positions. I just sort of I read through the racism bits with much little
Yeah,
interest.
yeah.
But I think the broken articles thing is a stylistic move because in his book, in his dissertation that he published under his real name, it's very clear that he can write sort of perfect English. And if you read
Okay.
this book,
All right.
there are some actual mistakes, and because I think he self-published this, so
I mean,
I
I hope
definitely it's a
so.
bit
I hope that
fucked.
this wasn't
But yeah,
press. Like, holy shit. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, if he was like a metrical poet, then maybe it would be a press.
Yeah, that's true. I was gonna say, if you were a metrical poet, this would be like, oh, Abel Muse's designs have gotten pretty good.
Yeah. But yeah, so the breaking off of articles is definitely a stylistic move because if you read through him, his sentences grow more and more complex in a way that's very fluent in English. He can pull
Okay.
off
All
quite
right.
quite
I
impressive imagery.
I hope so. The other thing I was gonna ask, because it's like I'm in it right now, and it's it's getting a little tough. He really is trying to debunk Darwin in a way
Yeah,
that
I
like
really like that part.
the problem is that he's saying basically he says like creationists fucked up because they were obsessed with anatomy when they should have been looking at behavior, because the thing that's really anti-Darwinian is the way animals behave. And the problem is like Darwin addresses animal behavior in great detail in like really beautiful passages where he describes how it is that animal behavior is influenced by natural selection in a way that's like it just feels like he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like it feels
Mm.
very naive as a way of like you're really trying to debunk this aspect of Darwinism.
Yeah, I don't think much of. I don't particularly. This is what I say. I enjoy him. I don't agree with him. He does have a nice idea somewhere about Darwin when he starts talking about how he thinks that like what scientific ideas should be understood. It's almost a very sort of weirdly left-wing idea. But he sort of talks about how we don't we sort of see scientific ideas as timeless paradigms, and that we should actually attempt to a little bit understand them within the sort of literal, cultural, and sort of historical mindset that they grew out of, which I quite enjoyed.
That
But I
that
think he
that seems
probably
fine, but he says Darwin is small-minded and all he is a collector of facts, and it's just like you clearly haven't read him. Like he's like his whatever you want to say about a lot of scientists. Like Darwin was an amazing mind, like an amazing
mm,
mind and an amazing right. Like he's not a collector of facts. He's not like if you're gonna attack him, this is totally the wrong way to do it.
yeah, no, yeah, I don't disagree. I got told to read this book because there are things he says that there are things, not political things, but things he says about how he experiences the world that very much reminded me of me. So that was quite nice and shocking
Yeah, and I'm
and sort of
interested too.
vaguely
And you have
familiar.
a like you've been kind of talking about this sort of critique of contemporary gay culture that you're like a there's a I mean Lucy K's straight, but he has a bit about it's very long ago and I can't come close to quoting it, but that there's a difference between actual homosexuality and like gay culture. And you have some similar
Yes. Yeah, well, I'm quite
critiques, it
interested in this
sounds like.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We can't really go into it in depth. I'm just
Yeah.
trying to think of a way of summarizing it very briefly. But yeah, I feel like
Because
I'm
he is
interested.
gay, or he seems like Greekly gay.
No, I think he is gay. I don't think he thinks he's gay.
Oh,
I'll say it
okay,
like that. You
great,
know?
great. Always a good sign. Right?
Well, no, that's some of the funniest things when he was sort of praising. It's a wonderful passage later. He says, I got a friend to get me into. I can't remember what statues they are, but he says I got a friend to get me into his museum showing these sort of wonderful Greek statues. And after 3 hours, I managed to ejaculate without touching myself, which made me then wonder if someone could think themselves to death purely for the idea of thought. I love how his mind works. I love after ejaculating
Jesus
without touching
Christ.
himself, he started thinking, can I kill myself? You know what? Like that kind of
Yeah.
thinking. It feels vague. I don't know how else to say, but it feels vaguely familiar to me. So I kind of find it vaguely companionable and
Yeah.
entertaining.
I mean,
But yeah,
yeah.
he has no self-knowledge. He has no
Okay.
self-perception.
Yeah. There's a Mitchell and Webb sketch about a medieval king who just keeps making all these terrible decisions, and his advisors basically are like, I think you're gay. I think what you want is just to have sex with a man, and then actually you would be fine, and you would stop making these insane decisions. Like, don't make this guy like the Duke of the realm. Just have sex with him. You just like him. That's all.
I haven't
So
seen that one. That's
yeah,
good.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I will give it a. I'm rereading the Book of Job, which I'm going to talk about with Brian. I have thoughts, but Ethan and Elijah will be displeased, I suspect. But
Yeah,
Brian is
well,
actually much more knowledgeable than I am
you
about that.
messaged me and said you didn't like it, and I felt very sad because I love the Book of Job.
Oh my
I'm gonna
God,
be
it's
Elijah again.
I
But
find
yeah,
it very boring. I find it's funny, like it is. I'm an ecclesiastic. Like if you want to find a book that like sings to my soul, it's Ecclesiastes. For sheer literary merit, I think the medal has to go to Genesis. Just like for like sheer compression of
mm,
narrative. Like there's so much there in a text that is
no, yeah,
like
yeah, for
substantially
sure.
shorter than Heart of Darkness, or it's like 30,000 words. It's very short.
Yeah, yeah,
And just like the number of stories that are contained in it are astonishing, and
yeah.
like iconic, foundational stories. So literarily
Mm.
Genesis, personally, stylistically Ecclesiastes. Job, man, it doesn't. Yeah, it misses me. It really does. But yeah, I've also have thoughts about like the nature of its boringness, which I think probably is telling.
I mean, we were thinking maybe about doing my response to the
Yeah, do you want to have to, a note on? I don't know if you
speech.
listened to the conversation with Mark
I did.
Leitner.
Well, he seemed like a nice and agreeable guy.
Yeah,
I thought you were I thought you sort of held the episode together. You were making the interesting comments about the speech, I'll say, but he seemed nice.
I was making the objectionable. Like I was the one who was being a jerk to Tony Morrison.
Yeah, well, if you go on my blog, you'll find me being even more of a jerk.
You
So,
are more of a jerk.
I've absolved you.
I'll link to
I
your
don't think,
comments.
I don't think the speech makes sense. I don't. So the speech is something along the lines of an old wise blind woman is met by two young people who want to trick her because they have a bird who they've concealed from her. I mean, they haven't concealed. You can't see it, obviously, and they say, "Is this bird alive or dead?" And Toni Morrison wants to argue something like that. This bird is represents language, but that doesn't make any sense. It just like I don't see how that logically follows on. Because the language is not inaccessible to either the blind or the wise, and B, the question about the bird is the question about how one can make comments about how to live in the world when one doesn't have complete access to the world. But that's not what quite language is doing. I'd say language also doesn't really give one complete access to the world, but it doesn't do it in a very different way from the way not being able to see a phenomenological object does. So that doesn't really make sense. What I truly found, the most irritating thing I think I found in her speech was when she starts talking about Babel. Is Babel, right? The Tower of
I
Babel.
mean,
I
I
never
don't
know if
know.
it's Babel or
Babel. I
Babel.
think people say it both
Babel,
ways. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, well, we'll say Babel, but the audience can laugh at me if it's Babel. She makes these comments about Babel. She says, maybe we broke down. The Tower of Babel was never completed. Our languages broke apart because we hadn't fully acknowledged the difference everyone else. And it felt sort of, I don't know, it felt cartoonishly left wing in a very irritating way. Maybe God, like guys, maybe we weren't good enough yet to get this. I was like, well, no, God smashed everyone's this sort of the pure Edenic language that named everything and gave everything the perfect signifier into this mash of, half syllogisms and sort of half fallen constructs and scattered everyone. And if, this pure Edenic language was, it was given to Adam and it was used to name the world. So surely it already contained all human difference and all human diversity and whatever. Like it contained everything because it was the original language that everything else attempts to strive towards in its fallenness. So this idea that we needed, to be broken down and diversified so we could understand each other seems just it seems it's very nice, it's very cute. It doesn't hold up at all to me, and I think the much more sort of the difficulty and the complexity and just the sort of inaccessibility of the Tower of Babel as presented in Kafka's parables rings, I think, a lot truer to sort of the difficulty and the inaccessibility of the world than this sort of nice fairy tale about how we need to love each other and make heaven out of diversity. You know what I mean? Like it felt
Yeah, it
it
did feel like
felt
it became a
cartoonish.
parable of multiculturalism in a funny way that didn't. Yeah, I mean, again, like that was why a lot of the seemingly progressive slogans or gestures of the speech felt like they were made in a way that I couldn't tell how many quotation marks she was putting. Like it
Yeah.
felt like if she were just doing a feel good progressive speech, there was a lot that would not be there that was there, and it would work. It would
Mm.
be simpler in some ways than it was. Like it was just I couldn't discern what she was after. And that was why I kind
Yeah.
of said like finally, and I think you had a similar remark, although you sort of say like it's not good enough. But at the end, when she just starts telling this strange story, it becomes compelling again because she's a good writer and stories are interesting. And like when
Yeah.
it just is interesting and is engrossing on the face of it, that becomes more powerful than the larger argument is. Although again, it's hard to say what is the larger argument because it does seem to wind back on itself. I was kind of interested in your argument about language because I think I very much disagree with you about you in response to her little passage. You say, "Indeed, but what does she think all language is? Language is limitation. Language is the oppression of reality by the counterfeit. To push such definitions solely onto the politically and culturally abhorrent is in some sense cowardice. Language is fallen. Fallenness cannot be avoided or only spread over the hands of certain objectionable parties and behaviors." I agree with you that like the fallenness of language, if that's what it is, can't be, you can't just say it only belongs to certain parties or that, that this only exists in the political or cultural realm. This doesn't make sense. But I also think that like I very much disagree with the idea that language is in essence limitation or that it's in essence the counterfeit or it's fallen. I do think that there is like part of what's interesting about the Tower of Babel parable is that there is an idea of a kind of a perfect unified language in which every word has its correspondent and everybody understands perfectly what is meant. And I think that is the idea that we often have in mind when we say things like, words fail, language can't capture this or that. But I do think that kind of ideal pre I don't know, pre-Babel language is not a real idea of language. I think that the language in its actual practice, which is like the most powerful technology ever invented, is about association before it is about correspondence. And so like the same thing that like the deconstructionists are so concerned with the slipperiness of language. Like, well, in order to define a word, you need words. In order to define those words, you need words, and meaning is always deferred and is always slippery. But like, I think that's actually how language works, is through that sort of shifting, associative, context dependent, way of triangulating a meaning or an intention or a direction to look in. And that if it was sort of rigidly correspondent and referential, then it wouldn't work nearly as well as it does. It's sort of like, in order for like cars to work, you actually need there to be gravity and you need there to be friction. Like in a pure ideal space, mechanical devices wouldn't work because they're dependent on the leanings and the limitations of the space that actually does exist. And I think language is similar. It's part of like I'm always kind of annoyed by arguments about what language can't capture and how language fails because to me they feel like they misunderstand the nature of language. But that's kind of but that's just I mean again that's not to defend her speech. That's sort of to disagree with both of you.
Sure. No, as we do on this podcast. But no, I don't disagree with that description of language. I think it's just that in the realm of attempting to do what at least I enjoy in poetry, when what that poetry attempts to do, it feels to me as if the poem pushes up against some barrier of articulacy, and it's on the edge of that barrier where the most interesting poems exist. And I don't think that's to sort of discredit your definition of language, but I guess like it's almost as if poetry, by at least in my conception of one of its important natures, is using language in a way that language isn't quite designed to be used for. And that's where many of the problems arise.
Yeah, that seems probably right, that you are, because I like, as much as I get annoyed by arguments about language failing, I also get very annoyed by the bad use of language.
Yeah.
Like not bad. I mean, I of course like don't like when people do evil with language, but like when people seem to misapprehend how it can work, and
Right.
like the thing that's annoying in like bad political speech or like bad student writing, bad AI writing that feels like it's not actually responsible to the workings of the language itself, or like even just sort of like failures of specificity, failures of precision. But yeah, I think that there probably is something to poetry that slightly it's like doctors talk about using a medication off label, which is that you were given a certain amount of leeway as an MD. You can prescribe drugs for things that they're not technically for, because sometimes they will work for those ends, even if they're kind of working despite themselves in that way. And I think that poets may use language in that way, a little bit
I like
off
that
label.
analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's good. I like that. That's very nice.
All right, that was our conversation. Just a quick word on, we didn't really get into, I think, the virtues of ContraPoint's conspiracy essay. The thing that I did find sort of particularly insightful was the way she discussed how she understands the three core beliefs of conspiracism. And they do, like, I did find myself pretty sympathetic to her observations and criticisms. She basically says the three core beliefs of a conspiracist worldview are intentionalism. That is, it's not just that everything happens for a cause, but that everything happens for a reason. There's a teleology, there's an intention behind everything. I'm skeptical of this in the political world. I'm also skeptical of this in the natural world, as will be a surprise to no one. The second central belief is dualism. There's, the universe is a fight between right and wrong, the forces of good and the forces of evil. We touched on that in the episode. And then finally, symbolism. This one is sort of the wackiest, but again, I find it like I'm sympathetic to her skepticism of it, both here and to some extent in like art. So her observation is that like conspiracists seem to believe that the dastardly conspirators have laid breadcrumbs all along the trail, have placed symbols everywhere to be interpreted by those who have eyes to see. And I do sort of like, I know that obviously in poetry people do that very literally and deliberately, but like I both am skeptical that is a thing that like, evil globalist conspirators do. I'm also skeptical that it's a thing that is a particularly good way to go about writing poems. It's the thing that like I found chafes me. I mean, one of the things that chafes me about the Divine Comedy, I love the Divine Comedy. There's an enormous amount to admire, but it does the idea that there are symbols consciously placed here for the reader to decode seems to me very backwards, like very backwards. I really I really am a believer in like if it's going to mean something, it has to mean it in, we have to recognize the feeling or recognize the shape of it as something before we have decoded it, right? If it takes decoding in order for us to have a feeling about it, then it was put in backwards, is kind of my feeling. I also thought I would say maybe one more word about her essay, her little post. I mean, it is sort of like a short essay on Palestine. I went and spent a little bit of time with it. I do think that I kind of stand by my earlier observation that she does seem unfortunately unable to distinguish between the descriptive and the prescriptive. Like she isn't able just to say like, here's what I think about it, the end. Here's what I think is happening, and I think that's bad, the end. She does sort of see, it seems, I mean, I think maybe this is like, if you're a public figure, if you have a particular influence, then you understand that everything you say descriptively is also read prescriptively, and so you can't disentangle those two things. But the other part that I thought was like I was much more sympathetic to was her discussion of like that basically that those who are critical of Israel are not content with her simply to state her opinions. They want one of her essays. Like they want her to put out a 2-hour, heavily edited, deeply researched, like high YouTube production value documentary together about the badness of Israel in Palestine. And her argument was like, I don't want to do that. And I don't think it would be a particularly good example of the thing I do. That I feel totally sympathetic to. Like that's where I very much have the feeling like if you want to make political art, go for it. But I am very intolerant of intolerance of people not making political art or not making the right kind of political art. So I was very sympathetic to that response. I do find her to be, as I think I said to Shane recently, like when I am, it's like the Randall Jarrell line about Turgenev. Like when I am reading her, when I'm watching one of her videos or listening to her, I think like this is maybe the smartest person commenting on contemporary culture today. I don't know if I think that all the time, but I certainly think that when I am listening to her. So go check out that essay, as well as what was the other one I recommended her? Oh, her on cancellation. I'm putting the show notes together right now. Counterpoints cancellation. I'll put that in the show notes, along with a bunch of other stuff we talked about. If you want to reach Cameron while he is in Chicago, write to me at sleerickets@gmail.com. If you'd like to hear a lot more episodes like this one, including plenty of Cameron being especially choleric, then go to sleerickets.substack.com, put in your email address, and I'll give you a week's access for free after that. It's pretty fucking cheap. If you have difficulty paying for the show but you'd like to listen, send me a note. I will hook you up. And if you have a little extra expendable income, then that may be redundant. Then consider becoming a motherfucker of the arts, supporting the show and supporting other listeners so we can keep doing what we do. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.